Greetings and bienvenue, midnight crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
I'm lucky to have found a community where people can talk about paranormal things without writing every single thing off as crazy. So, let me tell you my story. I was born and raised in Louisiana. I lived in a normal neighborhood in a normal house with normal parents. My uncle, on the other hand, lived deep in the bayou. I'm talking the type of shit you see in movies where there's a cabin on stilts with lamps hung outside in the middle of a fucking swamp. I didn't even think they existed anymore when my parents took me over my uncle's cabin for the first time. But here I was, right in front of it. I was about 8 years old at the time, and my uncle used to tell me stories about an old hag that lived deeper in the swamp. He told me stories about how she would come out every now and then to snatch up people who wandered too close to her territory and eat them. Now, my uncle was that special brand of asshole that liked to scare little kids half to death, so he would do things like this all the time. I was scared back then, but we took another trip out to see him when I was about 15. I had brought along my friend Tom, who needed a place to stay since his folks were abusive. Anyway, it was me, my mom, my dad, Tom, and my uncle. We would sit around this fire pit he had in his cabin where he used to tell me his scary stories. And he started back up telling us the story about the hag he'd told me when I was a kid. I remembered it and laughed to myself as my parents made comments like,
"They're a bit old for that now, aren't they?"
We spent our time there without incident until we were ready to leave, but me and Tom decided we wanted to stay over my uncle's place for a bit longer since we were having a blast over there. My parents begrudgingly agreed. There was a lot of crime going on under the heavy cover of the canopy of gnarled swamp trees, so my parents were naturally a bit uneasy about it. But me and Tom stayed with my uncle despite my parents' protests. Tom seemed interested in my uncle's story about the hag, much more than I was. So, he asked him if he knew anything else about the story. My uncle, to my surprise, had more to say on the matter. He began explaining that the hag could be found if you walked down an old path through the swamp, but you could only reach it by boat. Then Tom had this crazy idea. He asked my uncle if he could take us to the path. I remember looking at my uncle, thinking he was about to break the news to Tom about his story being bullshit that was meant to scare him. But to my surprise he said,
"Sure, we'll go tonight."
I looked between the both of them. My uncle was smiling. He obviously had something even more devious planned for poor Tom. If only he knew. It was about 6 o'clock at night when we started getting ready to get going on our bullshit witch hunt. My uncle gave us each a backpack and loaded us up with survival gear. I had some reservations about camping out in the swamp, but my uncle was a crazy motherfucker. Once we were ready, my uncle grabbed his gun and we headed out. He got us into his boat and off we went. He guided the motor at the back of the boat while I sat next to him, Tom sitting near the middle of the boat, looking around at the surroundings that were dimly lit by a lamp on the front of the boat. I looked to my uncle and asked the inevitable questions. What did he have planned for Tom? Why was he going so far with the joke this time? My uncle just laughed and said,
"You're gonna laugh your ass off."
I'm going to switch to shorter posts so as to break up the story into easier to swallow bites. We must have been boating for something like 10 minutes before we came to what looked like a dock. It was old and rickety, in much poorer condition than what I was used to. My uncle had picked one hell of a venue for all this to go down at. At least that's what I thought. We tied the boat to the dock and made our way onto a narrow path. Tom was excited. This must have appealed to some sort of fucked up sense of adventure in his twisted little head, but I was scared shitless. And I wasn't about to be the target of the cruelest practical joke on the planet. With Tom far enough ahead, I got to asking my uncle where he heard that story about the hag. It was way too detailed for him to have just made it up on the spot, to which he replied that he had heard it from an old babysitter of his when he was a kid. He told me that there was a lot of history behind this part of the bayou. Lots of murders and occult activity. But he was a relentless skeptic. So, on we trudged down the increasingly narrow path. As we walked, I started getting uneasy. My uncle was too giddy with anticipation to focus on anything but naive Tom practically skipping like a little girl in front of us, but I was all too focused on our surroundings. The trees in this part of the swamp just looked wrong. They were twisted in ways that seemed unnatural even for swamp flora. Like they were growing on an uneven surface which had far too many rocks underneath. Their branches spewed out from the trunks to hang over us, like the trees themselves were hiding the ground here from the sun's gaze. As we walked further and further, my uncle stopped, as though something was wrong. He had a confused look on his face. He turned to look off to the right, scratching his head. He was looking towards a tree. He called out to Tom,
"Hold up a sec."
And we waited there for a few moments, looking confused towards my uncle. Save for my uncle's lamplight, which cast a dull orange glow on the trees that surrounded us, it was pitch black. It was a bad idea coming out here at night. I looked to my uncle and asked what was wrong. He spoke with a hint of worry in his voice.
"We were supposed to meet a friend of mine here, but he must be further up ahead. Come on, boys. Stay close now."
He started walking forward. By now I understood what my uncle had planned. He had probably told a friend to wait somewhere along the path in a costume to jump out and scare us. But the longer we walked, the more uneasy my uncle looked. The trees were definitely catching our attention now. Either due to my uncle finally realizing something was wrong, or because the extent to which the trees around us had been warped was starting to look utterly alien. I had enough. I told my uncle we should turn back because things were just getting plain spooky now. A suggestion which was met with approval between the three of us. We turned around to make our way back down the path, and there it was. Directly before us, dimly illuminated in the light of my uncle's lantern, was the most disgusting thing I have ever seen in my entire life. As my eyes met with the creature's form, I was suddenly overcome with a sense of crushing dread. The thing looked vaguely like a woman, but its proportions were all wrong. The woman, if you could call it that, stood before us partly naked, its wrinkled and aged form draped with bits of dark cloth which did not hide nearly enough of its grotesque form from view. It was deathly thin, and its arms and legs were far too long to belong to anything meant to be on planet Earth. Its finger and toenails had grown to an obscene length, and a head of wild gray hair hung over the thing's visage. It was twitching in an unnatural way, as though it was having a seizure as it stood there. My uncle readied his gun, aiming it at the thing. His hands were trembling as he fired off a shot. But as the shot rang out, the thing was gone. I heard a blood-curdling scream come from my uncle. And then the sound of the lamp shattering. The thing was on top of him, its fetid claws tearing away my uncle's flesh as it tossed his rifle aside. I hadn't even seen it move. I ran in the direction we had come, not even bothering to look back towards Tom or my uncle, or the thing. The light was gone, and I was running blind. Eventually I had run far enough where I could see the light coming from the lantern on the boat we were brought here in. I heard something running behind me and looked back. It was Tom, just barely visible from the light of the boat's lantern. We reached the boat and pulled the string to start the engine back up. It stalled a few times, but eventually it started up. We turned around and began speeding away on it. We looked back with just enough time to see it standing there, on the top of the dock, dragging my uncle's lifeless body in tow. I don't know how we managed to find our way back to my uncle's cabin, but we did. We immediately called the police and then our parents. The cops arrived and we told them what had happened. Of course, none of them believed us, and neither did our parents. But something happened to my uncle. His body never turned up. But me and Tom know the truth. I moved to California shortly after that. But Tom's still living in Louisiana. He says he wants to go back. I'm starting to think he's got a death wish. I won't be joining him.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more Greentext will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.